Easter. It's, bunnies, chocolate, maybe a big family meal, and for lots of people, church.
Right.
But have you ever stopped to think about why we have these traditions? Like, what do they really mean?
Hmm.
That's exactly what we're diving into today, your personal deep dive into the Easter festival.
And for this exploration, we've pulled together a really interesting mix of materials you shared.
Yeah.
We're looking at a sociology study, quite an old one, from 1949, about Easter in America.
Okay.
Then there's a more philosophical take on its meanings, some perspectives from Christian groups, and a pretty detailed academic look at how the resurrection stories themselves developed, historically and theologically.
Wow, quite a range.
Yes, quite a journey ahead.
Absolutely. And for you, the learner, our aim here with this deep dive is to get past the surface stuff.
Right.
We want to give you a richer sense of Easter's many layers, maybe show some surprising links to the past, and offer a more nuanced view, but, without drowning you in details, we'll guide you through it.
Exactly. Our mission, really, is just to pull out the key insights from all these different sources.
Yeah.
And give you a really fascinating kind of well-rounded picture of Easter's importance, culturally and religiously.
Okay, let's do it. Where should we start?
Well, how about we look back first at how Easter was seen in America, say, historically.
Good idea. That 1949 sociology study you mentioned, it made an interesting point, didn't it?
It did. It noted that Easter celebrations were becoming much more prominent.
You're right.
It actually says it was once allowed to pass almost unnoticed by our Knickerbocker and Puritan ancestors.
Huh. So a big shift by the mid-20th century then.
A very big shift. And what's really interesting is comparing that to even earlier records.
Like what?
The study points to some New York newspaper articles from way back in 1876.
Okay, 1876.
Yeah. One described church services, Roman Catholic and Episcopalian, and another talked about how beautiful the services were. But here's the kicker.
What's that?
Neither article mentioned Easter parades or the Easter bunny or colored eggs. None of that folk stuff we associate with it now.
That is striking. So the religious side was there and noted, but the other stuff, maybe not so much, or at least not in those reports.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how and when all those different threads, the religious and the secular, sort of came together.
Yeah, it does.
Which actually leads us nicely into Alan Watts in his book Easter, Its Story and Meaning.
Ah, Watts. What's his take?
Well, he jumps right into what he calls the perplexing jumble of non-biblical customs around Easter.
The eggs, the bunnies.
Precisely. Colorful eggs, chocolate rabbits, even things like spring bonfires and kids' games.
And he doesn't think they're just random.
No, not at all. This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Go on.
He argues these curiosities are actually vestiges of a tradition far older than Christianity.
Older, like pre-Christian.
Exactly. He calls it a universal celebration of nature's eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth.
Wow. So linking Easter themes to something much older, more primal.
Yes. He takes the reader on this kaleidoscopic tour, as he puts it, through history, anthropology, myth, trying to trace these connections.
That's a fascinating idea, that the pull of Easter, the renewal theme, taps into something ancient in us.
It really is. And it raises a big question, doesn't it, for you, the learner, to think about.
Which is?
How did these seemingly non-Christian, maybe even pagan elements get so tangled up with Christianity's biggest celebration? What does that mixing tell us about culture and belief?
That's a great question to keep in mind. Okay, so we have this historical growth in the U.S. and this idea of older traditions blending in.
Right.
Now, let's maybe shift gears a bit. How is Easter seen and celebrated within Christianity globally right now?
Good shift. Wycliffe Bible translators offer that kind of contemporary global Christian view.
And what's their main focus?
Unsurprisingly, it's the core religious meaning. They frame Easter as a celebration of life, hope, and victory, all centered on Jesus' resurrection.
The central Christian belief.
Absolutely. But what's great is seeing how that core message plays out so differently across cultures.
They have examples.
They do. Like in Poland, Easter Sunday breakfast is a big deal, often featuring a special sweetbread called babka.
Babka. Okay.
And then you've got France, specifically this one town, Bessières.
What happens there?
On Easter Monday, they make a truly enormous omelet. Thousands and thousands of eggs.
Seriously? Why?
Well, the story, maybe apocryphal, maybe not, is that Napoleon stopped there once. He apparently loved the local omelet so much, he ordered the townspeople to gather all their eggs and make a giant one for his army the next day.
That's quite a tradition, Napoleon's omelet.
Indeed. Then if you look at Brazil, which is heavily Catholic,
Right.
Easter is naturally very focused on religion, but they also have something called Sábado de Aleluya, Hallelujah Saturday.
What's that like?
In smaller towns, it's apparently like a mini carnival celebrating the end of Lent, and gifting huge chocolate eggs is a very big thing there too.
Chocolate eggs seem pretty universal.
They certainly pop up a lot. The source also mentions Bermuda having unique celebrations, though doesn't give specifics.
Okay.
But back in the U.S., in Washington, D.C., there's the famous Easter egg roll on the White House lawn.
Oh, yeah. I've seen pictures of that.
Believed to go back to about 1878. Kids rolling colored hard-boiled eggs with spoons.
So looking at all these, Poland, France, Brazil, the U.S.
What you see, the learner, is this fascinating blend, right?
Yeah.
You have the deep religious focus on the resurrection, but then all these unique cultural expressions layered on top. Food, games, local stories.
Maybe even echoes of those older traditions Watts was talking about.
Quite possibly.
Yeah.
It really shows how a central belief can be celebrated in countless ways.
Okay, so we've seen the historical growth, the folk elements, the global diversity. Now, let's get to the absolute core, shall we? The resurrection narratives themselves.
Right. The heart of the matter. And our academic source, Revisiting the Empty Tomb, really dives deep here.
What's the first thing it highlights?
Well, it points out straight away that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they don't tell the exact same story about the empty tomb or the resurrection appearances.
Here are differences.
Oh, yeah. Variations in who went to the tomb, who they saw, what messages they got, what Jesus did afterwards. It's led to a lot of scholarly discussion.
About how to reconcile them. Or if they even can be reconciled.
Exactly. The study mentions Fienne Perkins, a scholar who suggests that the very divergence in the details indicates there probably wasn't one single unified story about the empty tomb floating around in early Christianity.
So trying to force them into one neat narrative might miss the point.
That's her view. It might obscure the different perspectives each gospel offers.
But there are other views, right?
Oh, sure. The study contrasts this with someone like N.T. Wright.
What's his take?
He tends to argue the differences aren't due to later editing or development, but more just the different ways in which the original astonished participants told the stories.
Like different eyewitness accounts of the same event, naturally having variation.
Sort of, yeah. He sees less narrative development after the initial events.
Two quite different ways of looking at the variations.
Definitely. And the study then suggests an interesting approach. What if we look at Mark's gospel as likely the earliest written version we have of the empty tomb story?
Okay, starting with Mark.
Yeah. And from that viewpoint, you can see Matthew, Luke, John, maybe even later writings as kind of interacting with Mark's version.
So not necessarily independent accounts, but maybe building on or reacting to Mark, showing literary interdependence, as scholars call it.
That's the idea the study explores, that there's editing and shaping going on, not just pure recollection.
Okay. That leads us to think about how resurrection was understood. What about Paul? His letters are earlier than the Gospels, right?
That's right. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks a lot about resurrection.
What kind of body does he describe?
He uses the Greek word pneumatikos, usually translated as spiritual. He contrasts it with psychikos, the natural or physical body.
Spiritual versus physical.
Kind of. He famously says flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God.
So not quite the same as walking around eating fish, like in some gospel accounts.
That's the tension, isn't it?
Yeah.
Paul's pneumatikos body seems different from, say, the very tangible Jesus in Luke 24, who shows his hands and feet and asks for food.
Right. That's a significant difference in emphasis, at least.
It really is. And this whole cult of the body leads into another fascinating area the study covers, the idea of assumption.
Assumption? You mean like being taken up into heaven?
Exactly. Bodily assumption into the divine realm. In Jewish and early Christian thought, this was often seen as a mark of God's special favor.
Okay.
The study mentions Günter Haufe, who concluded that for someone to have a special role at the end times, they'd likely need to be taken up bodily.
Who are we talking about here? Examples?
Well, figures in Jewish tradition like Enoch, Elijah, maybe Moses, Ezra, Baruch too. People believed to have been taken by God.
Right. I've heard of Elijah being taken in a chariot of fire.
That's the classic image. Now, the study notes a subtle difference between Jewish and Greco-Roman ideas here.
Oh.
Generally, in Jewish thought, assumption meant being taken while alive, whereas in some Greek traditions, it could happen after death.
Interesting distinction.
And we do see some later Jewish texts, like the Testament of Job, where Job's dead children's bones are taken to heaven.
Ah, so post-mortem assumption examples exist too.
Yes. And of course, in Christian tradition, you have the later belief in Mary's bodily assumption.
Okay. How does this connect back to Jesus?
Well, the ascension of Jesus, particularly as Luke describes it in his Gospel and Acts, seems to be patterned quite closely on these Hellenistic stories of heroes or special figures being taken up into the heavens.
So the ascension story fits within this broader cultural idea of assumption.
It seems to, yes. Now, let's switch tracks slightly again to the Sayings Gospel Q.
Q. This is the hypothetical source, right? The collection of Jesus' sayings used by Matthew and Luke.
That's the one. And what's really striking about Q, this discussion, it's basically silent on Jesus' death and resurrection.
Really? That seems like a huge omission.
It does. Scholars debate why. Maybe Q represented a strand of early Christianity focused purely on Jesus' teachings, separate from the death-resurrection focus. Or maybe it was meant to supplement that message.
But does Q say anything relevant?
There's one key passage the study focuses on, Q 13.3435.
What does it say?
Jesus talks about his future disappearance and return. He says, roughly, "You will not see me until you say, 'Blessed is the coming one.'"
Ah, the coming one. That links to the parousia, the second coming idea.
Exactly. But crucially, the study points out this is a prediction in Q. It hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
And the phrasing, "you will not see me," is interpreted by the study as likely implying a bodily disappearance, not just a soul departing.
A bodily disappearance, leading to assumption.
That's the connection the study makes. And it then links this idea to the original ending of Mark's Gospel.
Mark 16, verses 1 to 8. The women finding the empty tomb.
Precisely. The study suggests analyzing that scene as a disappearance or assumption story.
How so?
Because the revelation comes through not seeing the body. The angel says, "He was raised. He is not here."
Ah, I see. The absence is the message.
Right. It aligns with the early Christian proclamation, the kerygma, and the title Son of Man in Mark, often linked to suffering and rejection, but also future judgment.
Fits into this picture.
It seems to. Now, when you look at Matthew,
Yeah.
Matthew takes Mark's basic story but adds things. The angel descending dramatically, an earthquake, other holy people rising from their tombs.
Wow. Much more elaborate.
And Jesus appears directly to the women. The study suggests these additions might be Matthew responding to questions or challenges about the resurrection that had risen by his time.
Okay, shoring up the story, perhaps. What about Luke?
Luke, as we touched on, really emphasizes the physicality of the risen Jesus.
The flesh and bones, the eating.
Exactly. Almost pushing back against a purely spiritual or non-bodily interpretation. There's even debate about verse 24.1, where Peter supposedly goes to the tomb and just sees the linen cloths. Some manuscripts don't have it.
Complex textual issues, too.
Always. And then there's John's Gospel.
Another different perspective.
Yes, John focuses on the empty tomb and the beloved disciples seeing and believing.
Right.
And you have that slightly odd scene where Jesus tells Mary Magdalene not to touch him because he hasn't yet ascended to the Father.
Yeah, what's that about?
Difficult to interpret, for sure. Maybe suggesting he's in a transitional, transcendent state. John seems to view the return to the Father as encompassing death, resurrection, and ascension together.
A more unified process.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
And finally, this study briefly notes the later endings added to Mark's Gospel and other texts like the Gospel of Peter.
As evidence that people kept interpreting and expanding on the story.
Exactly. And it also mentions how developing holy sites, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, helped to kind of concretize the story, make it geographically real for believers.
Okay, wow. That's a lot to take in about the narratives.
It really is. So when we weave all this together, the learner, what emerges?
Well, it's definitely not simple.
Not at all. The Easter narrative seems incredibly complex, multifaceted, like a patchwork quilt, as the study puts it. Different traditions, interpretations evolving over time.
And the empty tomb itself wasn't always the central proof. Sometimes it needed the appearance stories to back it up.
That seems to be a key insight from the early evidence. There was perhaps some ambivalence, or at least variation, in how central the empty tomb story was initially, compared to the accounts of actually seeing the risen Jesus.
It's just crucial to grasp that the story wasn't static, right? It developed.
Absolutely. It evolved. And understanding that evolution is key to understanding early Christian beliefs and how they understood Jesus' vindication, his ultimate triumph.
So, to try and wrap this up for the learner, some final takeaways.
I'd say first, appreciate that fascinating blend of traditions, The ancient, maybe pagan echoes mingling with the core Christian story.
Okay, the blend.
Second, recognize the sheer diversity within the early Christian understanding of the resurrection itself. Different Gospels, Paul. They weren't all saying the exact same thing in the exact same way.
The internal diversity, right.
And third, just grasp the long historical journey of this narrative, how it was shaped, reshaped, and interpreted over centuries.
Evolution. Blend, diversity, evolution.
Got it.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with, the learner.
Yeah.
As you maybe experience Easter this year, with all its familiar parts, the eggs, the services, whatever it is for you, how does knowing about this really rich, complex, sometimes contradictory history, how does that shape your perspective on it all?
That's a good question.
And what does this ongoing evolution of meaning tell us, maybe more broadly, about how beliefs form and how cultures change?
Something definitely worth thinking about. We hope so. We encourage you to keep reflecting, maybe even dig into some of these sources yourself, if you're curious. This deep dive, really, it's just scratching the surface of all the layers within Easter.
Well, thanks for guiding us through that incredible journey, and thank you for joining us for this deep dive.